Now, the Thabo Bester saga has shone a spotlight on contracts between government and private security companies. Multinational private security firm G4S or G-Force was responsible for security when the convicted murderer and rapist escaped from Mangaung prison last year. G-Force officials have been unable to explain how the escape took place under its watch, while calls continue to grow for the contract to be terminated. For more on this, we're joined this morning by Private Security Network founder, investigative journalist Ruth Hopkins. She joins us via our video link. She's in the UK this morning. Ruth, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. I mean, there have been several investigations. Shall we begin by what Justice Edwin Cameron had to say in Parliament here in South Africa when he talked about G-Force and their role in not only Thabo Bester's escape, but in the conditions at Mangaung Correctional Centre, where he described it as dysfunctional. I believe he used the word rotten. There was institutionalized degradation. Given that, that's the situation at one prison in South Africa, the story continues at many others around the world as well.
Yes, indeed. And you mentioned the private security network. That's a collaboration I set up with journalists from all around the world who all looked into G4S operations in their country. There are stories from Nigeria, Kenya, Malawi, Denmark, Netherlands, UK, Colombia, India. And they paint a picture of a ruthless company that's not only involved in prisons, by the way. They also run various other security operations, and they just leave a trail of destruction behind them. And somehow their prison operation is particularly bad.
Yeah, detention centres also included in the investigations done by Private Security Network. Journalists like yourself, others from 5 continents investigating cases in 11 other countries. What is a particular difficulty that you find with investigating this centre, or rather the sector, Ruth, especially given that, you know, according to the information on your website, a lot of the information around contracts is often withheld on the grounds of commercial confidentiality?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. I mean, the problem investigating the private security sector is exactly that, the lack of transparency and the fact that these multinational companies often carry out tasks on behalf of the state, and whereas when the state would do it, it would be transparent and public, but when these companies do it, it's for profit, it's subject to a commercial agreement, it's subject to confidentiality. Exactly the same with Mangaung prison, the prison contract. That was leaked to me, but it's very hard to get a copy of that contract in the public domain, whereas I think this company is incarcerating South African citizens, so that contract should just be public.
Yeah.
Why is it not transparent?
And I mean, you've sort of set out to, through Private Security Network, to answer a really basic question insofar as G-Force is, right? As in, what is G-Force Security Network? Are you able to give us an answer this morning?
Yeah, I mean, G4S was a British-run company. It is now American. I think about 2 years ago it was bought by Allied Universal, an American private security contractor. It is now the biggest in the world, employing, I think, around 800,000 employees worldwide. And it sort of divides its business into 3 sections. There's the prison and detention operation called Care and Justice. And then the largest part of their business is just providing security guards, cash in transit, guarding buildings, etc. And then they also have a section of their business that's focused on warfare, on armed conflicts. They bought, I think in 2010, Armor Group, an American mercenary organization, and they've been active in Iraq, Afghanistan. So they also mix in warfare. And I think there you see that these very, very powerful multinationals interface with the most vulnerable groups of people on earth, such as people in warfare, immigrants, refugees, prisoners. They are often the people who have little other than their humanity, and they're often exploited and subject at the mercy, really, of these huge for-profit multinationals.
Wow. I mean, just as by way of a case study to give our viewers a human face to what you've described there, part of the information that we've gleaned from Private Security Network is the case study of Abdul Aziz Mohammed. He was a former detainee at Australia's immigration detention centre, and he, I believe, speaking to Private Security Network, described, quote-unquote, the first time I saw the evil faces of G4S. Can you tell us more about his particular case, Ruth?
Yeah, I actually know him quite well. He lives in Geneva, and I've met him several times. He's from Sudan, and he fled the country, as a lot of people from Sudan have. And he was on his way to Australia and ended up being captured and put on an offshore detention centre on Manus Island, which at the time was run by G4S. And the treatment there was absolutely horrible. And he started organizing in the immigration detention camp. He started organizing people. He started negotiating for better conditions. And then riots broke out. And then G4S responded to these riots with violence. And they ended up killing one refugee and injuring another 77. Sure. And it was briefly world news. G4S was fined, eventually lost the contract. And thankfully, Abdul ended up in Geneva, where he finally got asylum, and he's in safety and he's protected now. But yeah, he exposed what was going on in Manus Island.
Wow. I mean, that's one story, right? And the levels of violence that he talks about, it explains the trail of bodies left behind G4S.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they just have a terrible track record. I mean, if you look at the UK, where I'm currently based, they also ran an immigration detention centre here called Brookhouse. The BBC went in with undercover cameras and documented terrible violence, abuse, terrible racism, terrible conditions. And this was, again, national news. G4S lost the contract. Same thing happened to their Medway prison, which was a youth detention centre. The BBC again went in with undercover cameras, documented terrible conditions, violence, abuse, children beaten up by guards. G4S lost the contract. And then in 2018, Birmingham prison, also run by G4S, spun out of control, violence, riots, drugs. And then the government stepped in and took over the contract. And they also run prisons in Australia. I've been there, and I visited Port Phillip prison. And similarly there, it's just one riot, one disturbance after the other. And I think what is common to all these problems is that G4S, as a multinational company, tries to exert downward pressure on labour, so it doesn't employ enough guards to actually effectively control the prison population. There's not enough manpower available to actually run a prison, because they're budget cuts, and they're trying to save money, because at the end of the day, it's all about the money. And you can see that leads to problems in Australia, in the UK, in South Africa. It's in Mangaung prison. It's the same problem. There are not enough guards to manage the prison population. And they used to run prisons in the United States, youth detention centers. They've completely withdrawn from youth detention centers in the US because they made such a mess of it. They were just constantly in the news with terrible reports. They ran prisons in Israel, detaining Palestinian prisoners and Palestinian children. And they had a contract at Guantanamo Bay, run by the Americans, this very controversial prison. So they just have a terrible track record, and they mess up Yet again and again, they land new contracts. Governments don't hold them accountable.
Yeah, that was my next question. You say it's all about the money, and oh boy, are they making money. They're still, despite all of what you've just outlined to us, they're still so incredibly prolific around the world. Why? How?
I don't know. I mean, I'm currently based in the UK, and they have a lot of business here. They've been criminally prosecuted by the British government for defrauding the British government on one of their contracts. And you'd think, like, hey, that would be the end of G4S. Absolutely not. 2 years ago, a new contract was put out to tender for a 1,600-bed prison. Who gets the contract?
Wow.
Worth £300 million, G4S. So I don't know what the answer is. The only answer I can come up with is that we've all embraced this system of capitalism that in many ways is the next manifestation of colonialism, because it is built on the premise that the masses, their labor, will feed and will be to the profit of the elite. And, you know, it's capitalism gone wild, private prisons, as far as I'm concerned. I think you should never attach a profit incentive to the incarceration of an individual, because then an inmate becomes a commercial entity, and that in itself is a driving force to keep the crime rate high.
Exactly.
And yeah, I really think it's not uniquely South African, it's all over the world. And it's not uniquely G4S. It's a whole industry that is booming, and I think it's very, very worrying, because there's no accountability in this sector.
Yeah, government-private partnerships. I mean, it raises so many questions, as you say, Ruth, about why it works clearly in the favor of multinational companies like G4S to keep the crime rate high, and around prioritizing profits, let's say even around rehabilitation, rather profits than rehabilitation of inmates.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, specifically in Mangaung prison, which, I investigated for a decade, and I wrote a book about misery merchants. I'd say prisoners are not rehabilitated whatsoever. They're treated as animals. They're electroshocked. They were subject to forced medication with antipsychotic drugs. Some of them were murdered. They were beaten up. There was widespread corruption. So I would say in that particular prison, I have ample evidence that no rehabilitation took place whatsoever. And the inmates who left Mangaung, they were treated as an animal, and they would come out acting like an animal.
I mean, now that this is in the headlines again, Ruth, do you sort of hope that this will start the kinds of conversations that we're having this morning, bring about the kinds of questions around G4S and other private security companies, their commodification of inmates, as you say, or will it be what we've seen over many, many years, and what Private Security Network has also uncovered, that it's in the headlines for a certain amount of time and G4S continues to sign the contracts?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I hope there will be justice and accountability. I mean, I've spoken to, I think, probably close to between 100 and 120 men incarcerated in Mangaung prison, and they've told me the most horrible stories. I've seen the most horrible pictures of their torture, burnt body parts. They've been beaten up. So, of course, I want there to be justice and accountability. However, having said that, in South Africa, but also globally, like I just said, it's I think this private prison operation is very much symptomatic, is very much is deeply immersed in a system of neoliberalism and capitalism that we have accepted, that we've accepted that there are the masses whose labor is exploited for the elite. It all trickles upwards, the wealth. And it's so structural, and we've allowed multinationals to dictate our lives to such an incredible extent, again, all over the world, not just in South Africa, but in the UK, everywhere. there's a price. Life has been lots of things in life have a price tag that commercial companies exploit, such as healthcare, such as education, such as private prisons. And I think private prisons are the worst example of this profit-driven behavior. But it's exploitative and it's destructive. It does not help the masses. It does not help create a more fair and just society. It allows certain people to fill their pocket and most people to be exploited.
Just one of the angles to the Thabo Bester saga. Ruth Hopkins, let me thank you for your time this morning. She is the founder of Private Security Network. She's also an independent investigative journalist. Private Security Network is an online platform investigating the private security industry, and certainly incredibly damning, horrifying findings if you listen to that conversation. Ruth, thanks very much indeed for your time.